Tonight, the CBC presents the first talk by Dick Diespecker in his series, Great British Columbians. Mr. Diespecker, who is a well-known West Coast writer, is also a radio critic for the Vancouver province. Tonight, he talks about the great British Columbian, John Huston.
It takes all kinds of people to make a nation. Quiet, steady workers, kindly, compassionate, and understanding ministers, doctors, judges, trade unionists, farmers, artists, writers, musicians, and social workers. It also takes a few firebrands. That's what John Huston was, a firebrand, a pioneer, a fighter, a man of strong beliefs who held to them through thick and thin, who fought fairly but hard and never cared where the chips fell. Some people will recognize the name John Huston as that of the first mayor of Nelson, others as a militant newspaper man, still others as a rolling stone who wandered the continent as his fancy took him, others as the name of a member of the provincial legislature many years ago, and still others as the name of a great pioneer who helped in his own peculiar way to make British Columbia a great province. And they would all be right, for John Huston was all of these things. He was born on a farm in Caledon Township, Peel County, Ontario. He left school when he was 14 and wandered to Chicago, where he became an apprentice printer. From Chicago, as he grew to manhood, he wandered to New York, to Texas, to Missouri, to Montana. He worked as a printer, as a newspaper writer, as an editor, and as a publisher. He began to be known as a great fighter for causes. Anything he believed in, he fought for to the last ditch and enjoyed every minute of it. But much as he was feared as an antagonist, his reputation for fair dealing and loyalty won him 1,000 friends for every enemy he made. And much as he wandered, there was always in the back of his mind the call of his own people and the attraction of his native land. At last, just about the time the Canadian Pacific Railway reached the West Coast, John Huston came home to Canada. He appeared one day in the little CPR divisional point of Donald, and in a few days the people of that community discovered that they had a newspaper called the Donald Truth. That was John Huston's way. He figured it was time Donald had a paper, so he set up shop, being his own reporter, editor, typesetter, advertising salesman, circulation manager, printer, and newsboy. It used to be a favorite claim of John Huston's that he was born in Ontario, reared in Missouri, and matured in British Columbia. That might be true, but it is also true that Huston himself helped to bring maturity to quite a few places in this province. He was a restless man, but he missed very little that went on around him. After 2 years in Donald, he realized that there was no future there, so he calmly pulled up stakes and left. The next town to feel the warmth of his fiery breath was New Westminster. He stayed there long enough to establish the Westminster Truth. But the stories of gold and silver in the Kootenays were spreading fast, and it was finally more than John could stand. As fast as the trip could be made in those days, he made it. And one day in 1890, like a tornado out of nowhere, John Huston descended upon the tiny settlement of Nelson. Like the good newspaper man that he was, he lost no time in finding himself a shack, getting type and a printing press, and setting up business. His first paper was the Nelson Miner, and it was as wild and mercurial as its founder and editor, and as the country around them. The masthead was typical of John Huston. It read, "The Miner is printed on Saturdays, provided the staff is sober, and will be mailed to any address in Canada or the United States for 1 year on receipt of $2. Those desiring sample copies will secure same on receipt of 10 cents. Contract advertisements inserted at the rate of $3 per inch down the column for a month, and as much as patrons will stand. Crack, cure-all, private remedy, and next to pure reading matter advertisements are not wanted." At one time, a traveling printer arrived in town and asked Huston for a job. "No vacancies," said John, "but I want a fence built. Go ahead and build it." This shook the printer somewhat, but he built the fence, and Houston paid him for it at current printer's wages. Then an Englishman named Charlie Darts went to Houston for work. "Can you climb a pole?" asked Houston, who was in the throes of promoting the city's new electric light plant. "Yes," said the Englishman. "All right, you're hired. Go out and help them put up electric poles." Darts did as he was told, but when it came time to draw his wages, Houston offered him the regular laborer's wages of $2.50 a day. "Nothing doing," yelped Charlie. "I want the same wage as the other climbers got, $3.50 a day." Houston looked him over and snarled, "I never saw an Englishman yet that was worth $3.50 a day at that kind of a job." Charlie Darts held his ground. "I am," he insisted. "Okay," snapped Houston, "if you think you are, go over there and turn that hand press for 5 minutes. I'll soon see if you're worth $3.50 a day." Charlie Darts demonstrated his ability with the hand press, and he got his $3.50 a day. At one time, a lawyer named John Elliott incurred Houston's wrath. Houston promptly wrote an editorial about Elliott, which was anything but complimentary, and Elliott retaliated by suing Houston for libel. Now, there was nothing particularly unusual about that, for Houston was called upon many times in his explosive career to defend what he had written in a court of law. But during the trial, he got the idea that the judge was not handling the case as he should, and with his usual disregard for the consequences, he wrote a blistering article pointing out the shortcomings of the judge. Any normal man would have been caught, convicted, and sent to jail, but not John Houston. He always wrote his editorials by hand and in 3 parts, and the 3 parts were given to 3 separate printers to set. After it was in type, the original manuscripts were collected and burned in the office stove. 2 years after founding the paper, John Houston sold the Miner and immediately established a rival paper, the Nelson Tribune. And when that was well launched, he was over the mountains setting up the Rossland Miner. And make no mistake about it, John Houston was not content simply to report the news. He held up the mirror to public events, and through his editorial columns, which were among the most biting ever written in this province, he threw his whole weight behind anything that would help his town, or his territory, or his country. Before long, his activities extended far beyond the newspaper offices, and he was battling for the incorporation of Nelson as a city. When the battle was won, no one was at all surprised to find that its grateful citizens had elected Houston their first mayor. That was in 1897. He was mayor again in 1898, and again in 1900 and 1905. John Houston didn't found the city of Nelson because the community was there when he arrived, but he certainly built it into a city and made its name known in every corner of the province. In many ways, John Houston was a strange man. One of his idiosyncrasies was his hatred of the railways, first of the CPR and then of the Grand Trunk. Just what his hatred stemmed from, nothing is left to show. It may be that he felt they needed a watchdog to make sure they behaved themselves, and he appointed himself that watchdog. At all events, when he was elected to the provincial legislature in 1900, he gave the McBride government some uneasy moments. For this brand new member from Nelson had no modest notions about warming a back bench or serving a term as an apprentice legislator. He had decided at the outset of his career as a politician to be outspoken, and outspoken he was, to the acute embarrassment of his party and of his premier. He had also decided that he was the ideal man to be Minister of Mines, and he so elaborated his claims and qualifications to the premier that his name actually went forward for the cabinet. But the lieutenant governor of the time, Sir Henri Joly de Lotbinière, thought otherwise. He told the premier bluntly that Mr. Houston did certain things that might be all right for Mr. Houston, but would not, in his honor's opinion, do for a minister of the Crown. So he refused to ratify Houston's portfolio recommendation. And John, in a rage, disappeared in one of his periodic jaunts south of the border. Nobody ever quite knew where he went on these rambles or why. except that he had an incurable desire to see the other side of the hill every once in a while. On this occasion, he was finally located at Bullfrog, Montana, a new boom town. When he did not turn up in Nelson, the people who'd elected him began to get a little worried. Finally, a Vancouver newspaper man wrote and asked him the question uppermost in the minds of the Nelson citizens. Was he coming back to represent them, or had he left the country for good? 10 days later, the reply came back in John Huston's bold black handwriting. He referred to himself as the runaway conservative member for Nelson and held himself up to public criticism and scorn, lambasting himself with a journalistic vigor which would never get past the news desk today. All this he sent to a newspaper known to be liberal and consequently politically opposed to him, and gave them permission to publish it. Then, having shriven himself, as it were, he returned to represent his constituency, to be re-elected, and to serve still another term as mayor of the city of Nelson. But by then, Nelson was well on its way to becoming the queen of the Kootenays, and John felt that it no longer needed him. Perhaps he was needed elsewhere. After some casting about, he decided that Prince Rupert needed a little building, so off he went north by steamer, his bags in his hand and his old Washington press in the hold. That was the heyday of Prince Rupert, with the Grand Trunk Pacific newly arrived and the North Country ready to open like a flower. John Huston was feeling elated, looking forward to new fields to conquer as the ship pounded north. But the railway had got wind of the Dragon's approach, and a council of war was held. They were afraid of John Huston and determined to keep him out of Prince Rupert. It was decided that neither premises nor a site be sold to Huston to set up his paper. And that was what met John when his press was dumped on the wharf and he came striding down the gangplank. But the Grand Trunk Pacific didn't know their man very well. John had a few cards up his sleeve, too. He located 3 mineral claims, though he had no intention of mining, ran up a shack on his claim, moved in his press, and went to work on Prince Rupert's first newspaper, The Empire. And strange as it may seem, in spite of his undying enmity for the railways, John Huston was the greatest champion of the railway terminus at Prince Rupert. He made his enemies, but he also made his friends, and worked untiringly to exploit the natural resources of this district. In the summer of 1909, however, he got restless again. Prince Rupert was getting too civilized. He was looking north, where there was more to be done, and inevitably he moved north to Fort George. That was in the land boom days, and a provincial statute said that all land applications must be advertised in a paper published in the district. Always ready to oblige, John Huston produced the newspaper, the Fort George Tribune. A golden tide rolled into his little office, and John Huston did his best to keep up with it. But he was getting older. His eyes failed him, and then his health. He fought stubbornly against it, refused to listen to doctors, and drove himself until he cracked. Fort George is Prince George now, but there will be old-timers who remember when they put John Huston on the river steamer to take him to hospital. A press correspondent at Ashcroft asked a passenger if there was any chance of him getting better, and when the passenger said no, the correspondent decided that there wasn't very much difference between dying and dead, sent his story to Vancouver, where a very fine obituary was published in the Daily World. 3 days later, they received a letter written in John Huston's unmistakable scrawl, dated from the hospital, and thanking them for the very interesting obit, which, he said, he had read with pleasure. Then, with grim humor, he added, "I didn't know I was dead till your paper came, and even then I might have questioned the accuracy of the information if I hadn't known its reliability. Don't be putting in any correction. I'll make good on the story." And he did. Before the letter reached Vancouver, John Huston was dead, dying as he had lived with a smile on his lips, strong-minded, without fear. He was a great newspaper man and a great pioneer, a trail-breaker for British Columbia. That was John Huston.
You've just heard Dick Diespecker talking about John Huston, first mayor of Nelson. Next week at this time, Mr. Diespecker will continue his series with a discussion of the contribution made to British Columbia by the father of the Okanagan, Father Pendosi. CBC.